Thank you for joining me for another episode of Lip's Garage. At this point, it's just about 2 weeks until PowerTour. By the time this video posts, be down to 1 week left. It is Memorial Day weekend, so I want to say thank you for the sacrifice to the families of those who did give their lives in order to keep us free, keep us doing what we love to do, and just ensuring our safety. Let's talk springs. So my goal this week in the fair lane is to get the rear leaf springs replaced. Again, I've already done the rear shocks, and I'm going to do the front shocks. I'm going to add a rear sway bar. So what does all that mean? There's going to be a lot of generalized information in this week. Depending on your application, some of the information may shift as you get into a little bit more specifics. But again, there's going to be a whole lot of general, what is a spring, what is a suspension, what does it do, what part is responsible for what, and how they all relate to each other and work together to achieve a good, comfortable ride. A lot of the general comments are going to revolve around what the auto industry calls NVH, noise, vibration, and harshness. So whether it comes to what type of engine mounts are you running, what type of suspension, what type of spring rate, factory is going to give you, unless it's a specifically built vehicle, factory's intention is going to give you the most overall power, most overall ride, most overall comfort for the particular individual. So as somebody like myself who's an enthusiast and likes to drive a little more spirited, I'm looking at stepping up the game a little bit. If you have, say, an engine mount, if you've got a solid mount, well, as your engine is going to run through its normal motion, it's going to create some vibration. The idea of a factory mount is to absorb some of that vibration so it doesn't come into the passenger compartment. For somebody that's looking for a little more performance, that's lost torque, that's lost power to the wheels. You know, anything that is keeping you from getting 100% to your tires is going to be robbing you power one way, shape, or form elsewhere. So a solid mount is going to take more of that power transfer from the engine back down the drive line, but you're going to feel that more in the cabin. So as we're going through and we're talking about different options with springs, kind of keep that in mind that it's going to be potentially different for a specific application as opposed to just general information. So this is going to be an atypical coil spring. You'll see this application plenty of times in automotive use, industrial application. You'll see this kind of thing in an ink pen as far as your return spring. Pretty basic. You're going to have what's called spring rate, which is how much force it's going to take to compress the spring, generally 1 inch if I remember correctly. And again, just be kind of a general spring that you'll see in automotive application, generally front suspension. Some vehicles do have them in the rear. This is another type of coil spring, although very similar. This is what they call a progressive rate. In this particular picture, you can see the coils on the top are spaced much more closely than the coils on the rear. The idea behind this is as you go through your suspension travel, it's going to get stiffer or softer depending on where you're at. So you can fine-tune a ride for either a specific type of racing application or just a particular type of comfort feel. Although similar in design and appearance, the overall effect is going to be a little bit different. This is going to be a loaded strut assembly, and it's going to be part of this particular one's going to be part of a steering as well as just suspension. But it's going to be your shock, or in this case, strut, attached to the coil spring as well. While primary use was mostly in a front-wheel drive application, these are seeing more and more use in more and more cars. This particular design is called a coil over shock. It is more of just a shock than a traditional strut. And this one, you can change a few things on it, primarily going to be ride height. As you can see, there is a threaded shaft on the lower end of the photo. That collar can be adjusted to change your ride height. Not necessarily spring rate, although as the spring gets compressed, it does change the effect a little bit. You'll see this a lot more in tuner and custom vehicles. So if you got a vehicle that's, both a street strip, you can change the ride height for racing and then go back to something a little bit taller for your regular street driving. Now this particular one is called a torsion bar. If you can see the hex on both ends, when you have it installed at ride height in this nature, that's going to be at 0. And then as the suspension moves up or down, it's going to rotate that bar left and right, and it's always going to want to return to a zero balance, and that's going to be that spring tension. That's going to work very similar as a torque stick that I was talking about in the last episode when you put your wheels on. So it's always going to want to return back to zero. This is a straight bar configuration. Keep that in mind when we're talking about sway bars, because they're going to work in a very similar style. And this is what we're going to spend most of this episode working with. This is a leaf spring. This does a couple different things. One is going to create your spring tension. This is going to sit, generally speaking, front to back. There are a couple of vehicles like my Corvette that you have one spring that runs side to side. But generally, like in a regular truck or an old school car, you're going to see a pair of leaf springs run front to back. Now, the arch on it is going to give you your ride height. And then as you go through the operation, that's going to flatten out, and that's going to give you your spring tension. So as you can see, there's a lot of different spring types that are out there, and you've got a lot of customizing you can do. A lot of folks will take a regular coil spring setup and change it to a coil over. The idea, again, you get the adjustable ride height and adjustable spring rate of the suspension. You've got a lot of folks that will take a solid axle leaf sprung rear end, convert that over to something more drag racing style, and put a coil spring in there. Or air suspension is going to take the place of the shock and the spring at most applications and give you some adjustability there. Some of the trucks will have your regular leaf spring, and it'll have an air shock or an air spring to help with load assist, where when you're just regular driving, you're going to run on your regular suspension. If you're hauling a trailer or loading up the bed, that's going to give you a different weight rating and be able to haul level. So again, you can fine tune depending on what your goals are. If you're building a custom ride, if you're just trying to get a better ride out of a stock vehicle, there's a lot of different things that you can do to really fine tune that in. So all shocks or struts and springs are going to be your primary when it comes to suspensions. They do work in concert with each other. Again, the name of a shock, the full name is going to be a shock absorber. So the idea, whenever you hit something in the road, that's going to be what takes care of your compression. The spring is going to help it settle out. If you've ever had a vehicle that had a worn out shock or strut, you know it. You're going to bounce a lot more than what you need to. So they do work in combination with each other to give you the ride, to give you the handling, to give you the effect that you want. Now, as we're looking at the vehicle in question, you can see slightly that the rear end is sagging a little bit. As we get up closer to the vehicle, if you take a look at where the fender line is to the tire, that's on the rear, and then to the front. So here you can see the top of the tire, the other one you cannot. I know the gentleman that had this car before me did use this to tow a boat, and the assumption being that the springs are just wore out given the type of use it has had. So I'm not sure what factory ride height was on this, but when I did order up my replacement springs, I ordered them with a 1-inch drop, and they're what they call a split monoleaf. So it's just going to be one leaf spring, and it's going to be split in the middle and kind of give you a stack unit. But crawling under the vehicle, this one here has a total of 4 leaves. You can see one stops here, 2, 3, and 4. So there's a little bit different design. And you see here the rubbers that hold them in are wore out, and just ultimately time for a new set. One thing I do plan on putting on down the road is going to be a set of Caltracs. Again, those are basically going to be a traction modifier to help if I'm doing any kind of hard launches, especially when I put the larger engine in, keep things planted. A leaf spring is susceptible to what they call spring wrap. Coming underneath the hood, this is going to be the top of the shock that I have. This is going to be a shock tower. And see if we can see it through the wheel well, although it might be kind of tight. The shock comes through the center of that spring and mounts down below. So I will be replacing the front shocks just because I've done the rear. Eventually I will be switching this over to a coil spring suspension, and I'll be able to adjust that ride height to match what I've got in the rear. So the rear still may sag, but it'll do that intentionally, and it will ride better than if it was just a wore out spring to give that lowered look. The other piece that we're going to be looking in this project is what they call a sway bar, or an anti-sway bar, or a stabilizer bar. Again, all basically mean the same thing. And what this does is keeps your vehicle level in handling. The idea behind this works very similar to a torsion bar. At this point, we're at a zero balance for tension. If you get into a corner and one side starts to ride up as you're turning heavy into a corner, this bar is going to want to stay in a zero balance or a neutral balance. So it's going to force the other side back up, and it'll keep you flat through the corners. Now, I don't really have the equipment to show you the effect in real time, but essentially if you've got your sway bar set up like this, and you take a heavy turn to the left, and you feel that corner want to dip into the left, that sway bar is going to flex. And what it's going to want to do is keep that zero balance, and it's going to keep you smoother. So when you're going around the corner, you're going more smooth versus riding way up like that. So definitely on an older vehicle, when you got suspensions wore out or just 50, 60 plus years of design, you're going to have that. It's what they call body roll. Again, I've already got a sway bar in the front. So in this particular one, I'm going to add one to the rear. When I do the front coilover suspension, I will probably be increasing the diameter. Now, just like spring rates, you can have different sizes sway bars, different shapes, different mounting ways. All depends on the vehicle specifics you're trying to put it onto. The one I've got in particular is going to be offset a little bit because my differential is going to be offset, and it's got to work around the differential. So again, your specific one may attach a little bit different. We'll talk about that more when I get to the actual install. So I'm prepping to go ahead and get started to replace my springs. And of course, for some reason, I can never find a tape measure when I need one. I don't know what's worse for me, 10mm sockets or tape measures. So I do want to measure what the ride height is before and the ride height is after. I would like to see what they're considering a 1-inch drop on the replacement springs. And then that should give me an idea as to how much sag that I have. And again, even if I don't have a change in ride height, it should still firm up the ride in the back end because the spring is new versus being wore out. And then I'll know when I redo the front end where to kind of set the coilovers for there. Now, an old school method is to just cut a coil off to get a lowering on the front end. Not a big fan of doing that myself, just because you do change your spring rate and you do sacrifice ride quality for look. For a regular vehicle that you're not putting a lot of miles on, you're probably not going to notice much. But for what I plan on doing, and ultimately this is going to be a highway cruiser car, I don't want to sacrifice the comfort just to fill up that wheel well a little more. I'll wait and do it correctly. I'm up underneath the vehicle. Got everything jacked up where I can work on it. Got everything good and supported on jack stands. And I've got the rear end supported with a jack. Now you gotta make sure when you're doing this, depending on the type of vehicle, this one, my shocks do go through the lower spring plate. When I took the bolts off of them, the rear end did drop just a little bit. So as you go, you wanna make sure you've got something propped underneath the rear end. In this particular case, I'm not completely removing the rear end. If I was, you've got your brake lines you need to disconnect. You've got your e-brake lines to disconnect. You've got a lot more to do. With this one, I'm gonna lower it just enough. I'm gonna release it just enough to get the leaf springs out and then just put it right back on. Eventually, I will be upgrading this to a 9-inch rear end. This is an 8-inch, it's the little brother. Not quite as strong, but similar concept. It does not have a rear cover. Everything gets loaded through the front end. So it's gonna have a third member just like the 9-inch for quick gear changes and things of that nature. Now this particular one is what they call a spring under. So you can actually accomplish a height change just by putting a block in here. So if you put a block here, that's going to put the axle higher up, or in essence, drop the vehicle down. So if I don't have the ride height that I want when I'm done, I can do that without sacrificing any of the ride quality. But again, because I know for a fact the springs are wore out, I'm going to start with that and again measure everything out and see where I sit. Again, this particular one, you got the U-bolts that hold the spring plate in place around the axle. And then when I do the sway bar, that's gonna go across the axle and come to the back. That's what I'm really hoping I'm going to get a chance to have done. With this one, there is gonna be some modifying. You've got to drill into the frame section. We'll see where we're at that point to see if that's something I'm gonna be able to do before my trip, or if I'm gonna do it after when I've got access to a little better equipment. After a couple broken bolts, a few scraped hands, and a few choice words, I did get the passenger side leaf spring off. A couple things we're taking a look at. This will be the big end here. We got that comparable. This will be the small end here. Not sure it'll make a difference in the operation, but this one, as you can see, is wound under. This one is wound over. Not sure if that'll add to some of the drop or not. Also, as we saw earlier, we've got the 4 different leaves here. You got the center pack, a little rubber isolator, and we got the center pin to lock everything together. This one is a single spring. They call it a split mono, so it does have a little bit of strengthening right there where they do bind up. But this is meant to be a direct replacement. The only issue, foresight. Wish I had a little more of it. I did have one bolt break on my shackle. Now what the shackle does, that end gives you a pivot, and that's just bolted into the subframe or the rear frame. So this part here, you've got one that goes through the spring and one that goes through the frame, and it allows us to pivot. So as this goes through its motion, it's going to extend, it's going to shorten depending on how it's riding. So this is made to make up that difference as that spring goes through its motion. I did have the head of that brake, and I did have it deform a little bit as I was pulling it out. Now this is nice because it does give you a bolt through there. Absolute worst case scenario, I should be able to knock that out and just run a bolt through it. But I will take a look and see if I can get a replacement. Always better to have new than something cobbled together. I also had a bit of an issue with that bushing, but again, the new one's going to come with a new bushing in it, so I'm not worried about that piece. So getting closer. So as I'm waiting parts to finish up the rear suspension, I managed to get a few more of my interior pieces in. So I did some highlighting and painting. Not quite perfect, but it'll be good enough for the ride. Got rid of the dated wood color. Did put some billet hardware in. Got some new door cups, a new handle. I was supposed to get a couple of new door pulls. This one's not terrible. The driver's side has definitely seen some better days, but the ones that I got, although it claimed to fit, were not right. I've got a little bit left to do in this part. I'm going to glue down the trim cover there. Haven't decided if I'm going to try repainting this yet. That's not a hard thing to do, just a little bit of time. I've still got to put together the driver's door. I'm trying to decide what the time frame I have left, if I should go ahead and have that window resealed or just kind of run with it as it is, because it does work. It's just kind of loose. The seats are in and completed. A little bit of cleanup yet. I would like to get another speaker, but again, with the time frame, it's not a necessary thing. I can hear just fine, and the kids will probably have headphones on the whole time. I did end up finding a replacement set of wiper blades that kept the look. They're a little bit shorter, but they do work a whole lot better. So once I get finished, I do have to give it a good show and shine, but we're getting close. The only thing left is going to be the suspension work, and again, I'm just waiting on a couple extra parts from Calvert Racing. So here's my struggle right now to get this finished. Here's a spring perch underneath the axle. This is where the leaf spring goes. When I come up, my shackle would ride right about here, and I still have way too much of a gap. So I got a hold of the manufacturer, Calvert Racing. Really good guy, had a pretty good conversation with him, and he said for a couple of years Ford needed a spacer. Not all of them, just a couple of them, the way that they had their isolator. So that big old rubber isolator mount I took off the other leaf springs, there needs to be an adapter to make up the difference. So that's where I'm struggling. He's going to send me out the adapter. He's going to do it for free, which is really awesome customer support. But I've got 1 week. So I don't know if I'm going to make it. Everything else is just about done. I've got 1 or 2 small, very minor things that I want to finish up. That's more for comfort than necessity. But if I don't have that piece in time, I'm not taking this car.